Welcome to Study of War. Today we will discuss an interesting topic. Imagine a battlefield where man's best friend becomes a secret weapon. The Eastern Front saw some of the most brutal fighting in the entirety of World War II. The Soviet Union was desperate to protect its motherland from the advancing Nazi war machine, which sought to annihilate communism. This caused an unprecedented level of desperation that pushed the Soviet army to drastically change their war tactics. They had to use the defenders' advantage, as well as their ability to mass-produce cheap equipment to push back the better-equipped German forces. Weapons come in all shapes and forms. This is how the idea of the anti-tank dog was born. In World War II, over 40,000 anti-tank dogs were used by the Soviet military, mainly from 1941, when the first dogs arrived at the front line. After the Russian Civil War and Stalin's purges of the 1930s, the Red Army had to reform and adapt to 20th century warfare. So, in 1924, the Revolutionary Military Council of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics approved the introduction of dogs as military equipment within the Red Army. They weren't the only nation that tried this use of dogs, as the idea of an anti-tank dog dated as far back as World War I. Initially, their tasks were limited to search and rescue, first aid, tracking mines and people, rapid communication, assisting in combat, transporting small amounts of supplies, and the list continues. Ironically, German Shepherds were the favored breed. But there was a problem. The newly formed Red Army lacked any kind of personnel to actually train the dogs to perform these tasks. The training campaign started with anyone who had experience with dog training, such as police dog trainers, hunters, circus trainers, and animal scientists, who were recruited into the Red Army. Training took place at the newly founded training center in the Moscow region. At first, dogs were trained to carry supplies, track mines, and rescue people, tasks at which the dogs excelled. As stated before, one of the approved uses of the dogs within the Red Army was the destruction of enemy targets. With tanks becoming such a problem for the Soviets, a mine vest was developed for dogs, and anti-tank dogs became part of the workers' and peasants' Red Army. How did they teach these dogs to do it? They used food. They starved them, and then put food underneath the tanks to encourage the dogs. The operation should have looked like this. The dog runs under a tank, bites a specifically designed release mechanism that drops the vest full of explosives under the tank, and then runs back to its trainer. The bomb would then be detonated through a timer or remote detonator. In theory, this sounds pretty good. In reality, there were a lot of flaws with the training and execution. That's why, although a group of dogs practiced for 6 months, the reports about their performance were not encouraging. Just a few dogs could perform the task consistently. After this failure, a more evil plan was developed. To make things simpler, the dogs were only taught to run under the tank. A new model of mine was designed with the sole purpose of detonating as soon as the dog made it under an enemy tank. As you can imagine, the return journey was unnecessary. Each dog had 11 kilograms of explosives, carried in 2 adjustable pouches. The mine had a safety pin that had to be removed before the dog was deployed, something that would become a problem when this concept was put into practice. The initial deployment of anti-tank dogs arrived on the front line in 1941. The group contained 30 dogs and 40 trainers. When the 30 dogs were sent to the front line, only 4 successfully detonated near a tank. In the next period of time, a lot of problems about this concept surfaced. The dogs had been trained on tanks that stood still and didn't use their guns. When the dogs were deployed on the front lines, this created a problem as they refused to run under the tanks due to them not being used to the sound of gunfire. The small amount of dogs that tried to do their duty would be too scared to go under the enemy tank and would be shot by the tank's machine gunner. Sometimes the dogs were lucky, and they were taken by German soldiers to examine the weaponry, wanting to copy it themselves. They didn't end up taking advantage. Rather, one captured German soldier claimed that they found the entire system inefficient. Another side effect of the dogs' superficial training was that they would run back to the trenches with active explosives that would explode and kill friendly soldiers. 6 out of the 30 dogs had tried to return without completing their mission. Because of this behavior, the dogs had to be shot when they returned, and the trainers were furious. Some went so far as to say that the army did not stop with sacrificing people to the war, and went on to slaughter dogs too. Those who openly criticized the program were sent to the gulags, a natural Soviet response to a problem. The final nail in the coffin for the program came about when the dogs were deployed on a field where both Soviet and German tanks were present. Being used to the Soviet tanks, the dogs would blow their own tanks up. Talking about the difference between the German and the Soviet tanks, the dogs were trained on tanks with diesel engines, and the Germans used gas engines. Why is this important? Different sounds and smells were produced by the tanks. After 1942, the use of anti-tank dogs by the Red Army decreased as new and less inhumane roles were found for them, although training for this brutal job would continue until 1966, when the program officially ended with limited success on the battlefield. It is not known how successful the dogs were, although it is estimated that more than 300 tanks were destroyed using dogs. They were incredibly successful during the Battle of Kursk, in which 12 tanks were destroyed by 16 deployed dogs. This was possibly one of the most successful anti-tank dog ventures in history. This program is a true example of the desperation of the Great Patriotic War, the Soviet name for the Second World War. Pushed back to Moscow and almost losing it, the Red Army sought any means of gaining some sort of advantage, meaning that almost no tactic was out of discussion. There exist other examples of the Soviets using unconventional or even illegal tactics during the war, such as explosive sniper bullets, but none were as brutal to animals as this program. There were also other instances in which armies used dogs for anti-tank purposes. The Japanese used almost 25,000 dogs from their ally Germany, and organized several training schools in Japan, and one in China at Nanjing. The Viet Minh also tried dogs, as well as the United States. The US had many of the same issues as the Soviets, but their dogs were not sent into service, as the program was canceled while training was still going on. A more recent instance of the anti-tank use of dogs was in Iraq, where the insurgents used remote control explosives, but as their predecessors, they didn't have success in their attempts. They realized using donkeys was a better option. Anyway, protests rose up among Muslims who believe that animals should be killed only for food. Interesting. Tell us in the comments what you think about this inhumane use of dogs as weapons. This method of using dogs as anti-tank weapons highlights the desperation of the Soviet army that had no efficient way to counter the German tanks. See you next time, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this.